When I hear Absolute, I immediately think of overpriced vodka. So let's see if Absolute Brown has me thinking the same. Without the vodka, that is. Boy, it's been a while since we've done this whole talking the camera thing that we're doing right now, and we'll see how it goes. All joking aside though, today we're finishing up our look at the Waterman ink lineup and taking a look at an ink that has been suggested to me at least 3 or 4 dozen times. Waterman Absolute Brown. I've got to admit, before I actually wrote the intro for this, I had to go through and do the section on the ink blot so I could get my thoughts wrapped around what I really feel about this one. I like giving you guys a good idea of my overall thoughts before we get into the KPIs, or key performance indicators as they are, when it comes to each ink or product, and with this ink, it's a little interesting. I find myself a little bit conflicted, and you'll see why. The color is on point, and I would suggest it to anyone, kind of like how it was suggested to me. But where it falls apart for me is kind of the water performance, which seems to be a trend with Waterman inks. I will say though, the dry time is a very pleasant shocker, and I think it's an ink that I could see myself buying again and again. It's a good brown ink, I have to admit that. But let's go ahead and take a look at how this ink looks on paper and see if it's a good brown ink for you. I know at least 48 of you have suggested it, so that's a good start. Or something. Starting with the ink blot, I'm starting to see why people would think that I would actually like this color. The warm undertones are a nice addition and go a long way to making this a pleasing tone. The lighter tones present a very nice sepia that I actually prefer more than the tan sepias that you tend to find in these types of brown inks. The midtones continue that warming trend as we fade into what I would actually consider to be a true brown transition, and speaking of those transition tones, the red undertones create a nice velvet look to the overall brown as we go into a nice subtle fade to black. If there's one thing that Waterman has done well throughout this entire process with their inks, it's creating a nice soothing transition with each and every color. Absolute Brown is actually no different here. Looking at the dry time, we're getting a really good look at one of the things that I like most about this ink. On Rhodia, we are looking at sub 15 seconds for completely dry, and over on Tomoe, we're looking at around 20 seconds. So overall, this is good performance, and it does help weasel Absolute Brown closer to the workplace. The big thing though, is how does this ink react with water? Short answer, not so good. Let's go ahead and take a look. Once we get water on the page, we are once again greeted with the very familiar color lift that we've seen on other Waterman inks. And yes, once we get the water off the page, what we see is kind of expected for that amount of color lift. There is an extremely faint ghosting layer, and I have to emphasize faint here. There may be some situations where this would be unrecoverable, and that's not a good thing. So if you are going to bring this ink into the workplace, or use it as a regular ink, keep it away from water. It's not going to do well if it gets wet. And now that we've looked at these key performance indicators, let's take a look at how the ink looks over on paper. Going into the writing samples, we're going to start off with Rhodia. Right off the bat, I want to point out that this is a more narrow line width than the broad nib on this Kaweco Sport would lead you to believe. This is writing more like a fine, bordering on medium instead of a true broad. You'll see a more broad nib width later on over on Tomoe, but we're just not getting that here. This ink though, it flows pretty well, and I haven't had any hard starting with it. But it is a very dry feeling ink. And it almost feels drier than the sub 15 second dry time that we saw earlier on in the review. I will say though, I like the color profile that we are getting here from this nib, and overall we are seeing those red undertones come through into the brown, and we are closer to those transition tones than I really thought we were going to be, especially with the more narrow line width that we seem to be getting here. It does cause this to be a little bit scratchy though, due to not having that buffer of ink between the paper and the nib, but it's not unpleasant feeling. I still have a fun writing experience with this, and it's something that I could see myself coming back to. Over on Tomoe, I'm noticing the trend that I've seen with other Waterman inks appear once again on this paper. What I mean by that is the color is flat. Most other ink brands, when you switch from Rhodia to Tomoe, you end up with a richer color when you switch over, and we just aren't getting that here. I honestly don't know how to feel about that. Over on Rhodia, we have those nice red undertones. They're just coming through. Everything is bold. The ink is popping. Over here on Tomoe though, it's a bit more dull and a little bit more sepia inspired. And while we're getting a broad line width, I actually find that I prefer this ink over on Rhodia, which for me is completely backwards. Do I find that to be a deal breaker though? No, not really. I still like this ink. It's going to be on the shelf as soon as I'm done with this video. And I think that is the most important thing here. It's well controlled, it does work on both papers, but you just have to keep in mind what color profile you're going to get from one to the other. It does have enough lubrication to keep from hard starting, and I haven't had any issues with it in the 2.5 weeks that I've been using it. So, good job, Waterman. As a brand, you've done more hits than misses. I mean, I still wish you could have done better on Audacious Red, but it is what it is. And that's going to do it for my look at Waterman Absolute Brown. If you liked the video or found it helpful, hit that thumbs up, get subscribed, and if you want to help support the channel and Ink Fund, click on that Patreon link down below. Till next time, don't drink the ink.